The Haversham estate stood as a monument to wealth and prosperity in the hills overlooking the small town of Millfield, Massachusetts. Constructed in 1842 by shipping magnate Theodore Haversham, its imposing Gothic architecture and sprawling grounds represented everything the townspeople both admired and resented about the family whose name it bore. The mansion featured 27 rooms, including a grand ballroom with imported Italian marble floors, a library housing over 5,000 volumes, and servant quarters that could accommodate a staff of 15. But it was what lay beneath this opulent display of status and influence that would eventually bring ruin to one of New England's most prominent families. In the late autumn of 1879, during renovations to expand the wine cellar, workers uncovered a hidden door behind a false wall, a discovery that would unravel a tapestry of horror that had been carefully concealed for decades. To understand the significance of this discovery, one must first understand the Haversham family and their place in 19th century Massachusetts society. Theodore Haversham had arrived in Boston in 1831. A young man of 23, with modest inheritance from his father's small shipping business in Rhode Island. What distinguished Theodore from countless other ambitious young men of his era was not merely his business acumen, but the cold, calculating precision with which he applied it. Within a decade, he had transformed his single vessel into a fleet of 17 ships, establishing trade routes that stretched from New England to the Caribbean, South America, and as far as the ports of West Africa. The Havsham Shipping Company became synonymous with efficiency and reliability, though those who dealt directly with Theodore often remarked on his unusual approach to business negotiations, clinical, detached, as though each transaction were a scientific experiment rather than a human exchange. In 1837, Theodore married Catherine Winslow, daughter of a prominent Boston banker, in what contemporaries described as a cordial but hardly romantic union. The marriage produced 3 children: William, born in 1839, Edward, born in 1842, and Margaret, born in 1845. Edward died of scarlet fever at age 9, an event that, according to Catherine's correspondence with her sister, affected Theodore less than might be expected. He observed our boy's decline with a detachment I found disturbing, Catherine wrote in November of 1851. On the night Edward passed, I discovered Theodore in the sick room after midnight. Not in mourning, but taking notes on our child's final symptoms with the dispassion of a medical student. When I protested this behavior, he merely stated that all phenomena deserve documentation, particularly those of a terminal nature. Catherine herself died in 1857 under circumstances that were considered unremarkable at the time, but take on a more sinister cast in light of later discoveries. Official records indicate death from nervous exhaustion and heart failure, a common diagnosis in an era when the medical understanding of cardiac conditions remained limited. Her personal correspondence in the months before her death, however, reveals increasing concern about her husband's activities. In a letter to her brother dated March 1857, she mentioned Theodore's growing obsession with his special studies conducted in a private area of the estate. He has converted the old storage room adjacent to the wine cellar into what he terms his philosophical laboratory, though he permits neither myself nor any of the servants to enter. The sounds that occasionally emerge from behind that door, mechanical whirring, the clink of glass, and once, I am certain, a moan that could only have been human, have disturbed my sleep for weeks. When questioned, Theodore dismisses my concerns as feminine hysteria and suggests I increase my laudanum dosage. Catherine's brother, James Winslow, visited the estate shortly after receiving this letter. His subsequent correspondence with family members indicates that he found Theodore's behavior troubling enough to consider removing Catherine from the household. Before any such action could be taken, however, Catherine was found dead in her bed on the morning of April the 12th, 1857. Theodore summoned the family physician, who attributed her death to natural causes exacerbated by her delicate constitution and history of nervous complaints. She was buried in the Haversham family plot within 48 hours, an unusually rapid interment that James Winslow later described as indecently hasty, even by the standards of the day. Theodore himself appeared to mourn appropriately in public, but, according to household staff, returned to his laboratory the very evening of the funeral. Following Catherine's death, Theodore focused increasingly on his business empire and what staff came to refer to as his private research. William, his eldest son and heir, was sent to Harvard College in 1857, where he studied economics and business management in preparation for eventually joining the family enterprise. During William's university years, Theodore expanded both his shipping operations and his philanthropic activities, making significant donations to Massachusetts General Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. These contributions focused specifically on advancing anatomical research and surgical techniques, interests that aligned with his emerging public persona as a patron of medical science. It was during this period, from roughly 1857 to 1865, that Theodore's secret activities reached their peak, coinciding with the years of the American Civil War, when public attention was diverted and the disappearance of transient individuals might go unnoticed amid the broader chaos of a nation in conflict. From ship manifests and company records later examined by William, we know that Theodore made unusual modifications to several of his vessels during these years, including the creation of specialized cargo holds with enhanced security features, ostensibly designed for valuable and sensitive freight. Similarly, renovations to the Haversham estate during this period included significant modifications to the basement level, recorded in contractor invoices as expansion and reinforcement of cellar foundation, and installation of specialized drainage systems for wine storage. The town of Millfield itself, nestled in the hills 20 miles west of Boston, provided an ideal setting for Theodore's activities. Originally established as a mill town in the late 18th century, by the 1850s, it had developed into a community stratified between the wealthy families who owned the textile mills and the workers, many of them immigrants or transient laborers who staffed them. The Haversham estate, situated on 50 acres at the town's northern edge, existed in splendid isolation, its grounds surrounded by wrought iron fencing and dense woodland that ensured privacy. The mansion's position on elevated ground gave it commanding views of the town below, while keeping the estate itself somewhat removed from public scrutiny. This, then, was the setting in which our story truly begins. November 12, 1879, nearly 3 years after Theodore Haversham's death from what was diagnosed as cerebral apoplexy. William Haversham, now 40 years old, had taken ownership of the estate following his father's passing. Unlike Theodore, whose cold precision had defined his public and private dealings, William had developed a reputation for warmth and sociability. He had expanded the mansion to better accommodate the elaborate dinner parties and social events he frequently hosted for Boston's elite, earning a reputation as one of New England's most generous hosts. His marriage to Elizabeth Carrington, daughter of a prominent Rhode Island judge, in 1869, had been described in Boston society pages as a union of genuine affection, refreshingly devoid of the mercenary considerations that so often characterize marriages among the commercial aristocracy. According to the personal diary of Elizabeth Haversham, the discovery of the hidden chamber occurred on a Tuesday afternoon when she was overseeing the delivery of a shipment of French wines. The workers had been removing a section of brick wall to create additional storage space when one of them noticed an inconsistency in the mortar pattern. Upon further inspection, they discovered that a portion of the wall had been constructed separately from the rest of the basement, a fact that would have remained undetected had they not been specifically looking to modify that section. What they found behind this false wall would change the trajectory of the Haversham family forever. Elizabeth's diary entry from that day, now preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, provides a first-hand account. The foreman called for William and myself to view their discovery. A narrow iron door set into the foundation stones, secured with a padlock that appeared significantly older than the surrounding construction. William was immediately troubled by its presence, insisting that his father had never mentioned any sealed room in the basement. After some deliberation, he ordered the lock broken. I confess I felt a distinct unease as the workers proceeded, as though we were disturbing something that was deliberately hidden from us. The sound of that ancient lock breaking echoed through the cellar like the crack of a pistol shot, and I shall never forget the rush of stale, fetid air that escaped as the door swung open. What awaited the Havershams behind that iron door was a chamber approximately 15 feet square with walls of unadorned stone. The room contained several items that, at first glance, seemed innocuous enough. A wooden table bolted to the floor, several shelves lined with glass bottles and jars, a small writing desk with a leather-bound journal, and various implements of brass and steel whose purpose was not immediately apparent. But it was the floor that drew their immediate attention. Specifically, the peculiar arrangement of drainage channels carved into the stone, all flowing toward a central grate. The room had been designed with meticulous attention to drainage, with an elaborate system that appeared capable of handling substantial quantities of fluid. This architectural feature alone would have been curious, but it was the stains, dark, rust-colored marks deeply embedded in the porous stone, that caused Elizabeth to exit the room in distress. The foreman who had discovered the room, Patrick Donnelly, would later provide testimony regarding its condition when first opened. Donnelly, an Irish immigrant who had worked in construction throughout the Boston area for 15 years, described the chamber as having a smell unlike any cellar or crypt I've encountered. Not merely the mustiness of disuse, but something sharper, like the tanneries I knew in my youth, but with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of the battlefield hospitals during my service in the war. Donnelly also noted that the iron door itself showed signs of sophisticated craftsmanship, with a locking mechanism far more complex than would be typical for a storage room. It was designed, he observed, to keep something in as much as to keep others out. William Haversham, according to household staff accounts collected in the years following, ordered the workers to leave immediately, providing them with additional compensation for their silence regarding what they had seen. He then locked himself in the hidden chamber for several hours. When he emerged, he instructed the butler to send for Dr. James Morrison, a longtime family friend and physician who had attended Theodore Haversham in his final days. What transpired between William and Dr. Morrison remains largely undocumented. But from Elizabeth's subsequent diary entries, we know that William became increasingly withdrawn and troubled in the days that followed. Dr. Morrison himself was a figure of some significance in Boston medical circles. A graduate of Harvard Medical School in 1842, He had served as a field surgeon during the Mexican-American War, before establishing a successful practice catering to Boston's upper classes. His association with Theodore Haversham dated back to the early 1850s, when Morrison became the family physician and a frequent guest at the Haversham estate. Morrison's own medical journals, kept meticulously throughout his career, suggest a man deeply committed to scientific advancement, but equally concerned with ethical considerations. A combination that would become critically important in the aftermath of the basement discovery. On November 15, 1879, 3 days after the discovery of the hidden chamber, William began a systematic examination of his father's papers and correspondence. Elizabeth wrote that he spent nearly 16 hours in the study, refusing meals and speaking to no one as he pored over documents that had remained untouched since Theodore's death. It was during this investigation that William discovered a locked drawer in his father's desk, concealed behind a false panel. Inside was a small brass key and a sealed envelope bearing William's name in his father's distinctive handwriting. The contents of this letter have never been made public, but its impact on William was profound and immediate. Elizabeth's diary entry from November 16th reads, "William came to me this evening in a state I have never before witnessed. His complexion was ashen, his hands trembling so severely he could barely hold his glass of brandy. When I inquired about the letter from his father, he looked at me with such hollow eyes that I scarcely recognized him as my husband. My father," he said, "was not the man I believed him to be." He would say nothing more on the subject, but informed me that he would be returning to the cellar room with Dr. Morrison to conduct a more thorough examination. He asked that under no circumstances was I to follow him or send any of the servants down. I have never seen fear in William's eyes before tonight, and it has left me deeply disturbed. Dr. Morrison's medical journal, later discovered among his personal effects following his death in 1892, provides some insight into what was found during their examination of the hidden chamber. Morrison documented his observations with clinical detachment. At W.H.'s request, I have examined the recently discovered chamber beneath his family home. The room appears to have been designed and equipped for anatomical study, though the nature of this study falls well outside the bounds of conventional medical practice. The implements present include several surgical tools of exceptional quality, though modified in ways that suggest purposes beyond standard medical procedure. Of particular note are the restraint mechanisms integrated into the central table, an arrangement I have not encountered even in psychiatric institutions. Morrison's journal continues with a detailed inventory of the glass containers found on the shelves. Many contained preserved specimens, human tissue samples according to his assessment, labeled with dates spanning from 1843 to 1865, corresponding to the middle decades of Theodore Haversham's life. Most disturbing were Morrison's notes regarding the leather journal found on the writing desk. The volume contains detailed records of Theodore H.'s experiments, written in a cipher that W. has partially decoded based on a key found among his father's papers. What little I have been able to review suggests a methodical investigation into what Th referred to as the physiological foundations of the moral sense. The explicit details of his methodology are too troubling to commit even to my private journal. But it is evident that Theodore believed he could isolate and identify the physical seat of human morality through systematic anatomical exploration. The implications of Morrison's account are difficult to ignore. Theodore Haversham, a man celebrated in local historical records as a philanthropist and patron of medical research, had apparently been conducting clandestine experiments of a most disturbing nature in a specially constructed chamber beneath his family home. The question that immediately arises, and which has plagued historians and criminologists who have studied the case, is the source of Theodore's research subjects. The period of the experiments coincided with a series of disappearances reported in shipping manifests from Theodore's merchant vessels, specifically crew members who were listed as having abandoned ship at various ports along the eastern seaboard and Caribbean. Between 1843 and 1865, 37 individuals were recorded as deserters from Haversham ships, a number significantly higher than those of comparable shipping operations during the same period. An analysis of these shipping records reveals several patterns that suggest these disappearances were anything but random. The majority of those who deserted were individuals with minimal family connections, recent immigrants, orphaned seamen, or men estranged from their relatives. Most telling was the fact that in nearly every case, the desertions occurred during voyages where Theodore Haversham himself was aboard, ostensibly conducting business inspections of his fleet operations. Ships that reported desertions invariably returned to Boston rather than continuing their planned trade routes, often citing urgent business requirements or cargo reconsideration as justification for the altered itinerary. In several instances, these returns coincided with nighttime dockings, unusual for commercial vessels of the era, with cargo offloading supervised personally by Theodore, rather than his usual dock managers. Dock workers interviewed decades later recalled Theodore's insistence on privacy during these operations and the presence of unmarked carriages waiting to transport unspecified cargo directly to the Haversham estate. The town of Millfield itself experienced several unexplained disappearances during these years, though contemporary newspaper accounts attributed them to the transient nature of the industrial workforce that passed through the region. Most notable was the case of Michael Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who came to Millfield in 1852 seeking employment. Sullivan found work as a groundskeeper at the Havsham estate, but vanished without a trace after only 3 months. Town records indicate that Theodore Haversham himself reported Sullivan's disappearance, suggesting the man had likely moved on to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In light of the 1879 discoveries, this explanation takes on a far more sinister aspect. William Haversham's response to what he learned about his father was swift and absolute. On November 20th, 1879, he ordered the hidden chambers sealed, not merely locked, but completely filled in with concrete and brick. Elizabeth's diary indicates that William personally supervised this work, which was carried out at night by workers brought in from a neighboring town, none of whom were familiar with the Haversham family. These workers were paid handsomely and sent away immediately upon completion of their task. William then turned his attention to his father's papers, systematically destroying correspondence, journals, and business records that spanned decades. Elizabeth described watching as her husband burned document after document in the library fireplace, working methodically through the night until nothing remained but ashes. There was something ritualistic in his destruction of father's papers, Elizabeth wrote on November 22nd. He handled each document with a curious reverence before committing it to the flames, as though performing last rites for the man he had believed his father to be. When I asked if he might be destroying important business records, he replied, "There is no business important enough to preserve this legacy." By dawn, when the last of the papers had been reduced to ash, I found him kneeling before the fireplace, weeping not with sadness, but with a kind of desperate relief. "It's done," he told me. "Whatever remains of him now exists only in memory and in blood." William's sister, Margaret Haversham Caldwell, arrived at the estate on November 25th, summoned by her brother's uncharacteristically urgent telegram. Their meeting, conducted privately in Theodore's former study, lasted over 6 hours. The household staff reported hearing raised voices at various points, including what the butler described as a scream of pure anguish from Margaret. When the siblings emerged, Margaret appeared visibly shaken, her composure, for which she was well known in Boston society, thoroughly broken. She departed the following morning without speaking to anyone, including Elizabeth, and severed all contact with the family for nearly a decade. Her diary, discovered after her death in 1919, contains only a single entry regarding this visit. November 25, 1879. William has told me about Father. God help us both. I cannot write of it, cannot speak of it, can scarcely bear to think of it. The Haversham name is poison. The psychological impact of these events on William Haversham cannot be overstated. In the months that followed, he transformed from a sociable, confident businessman into a reclusive figure plagued by insomnia and suspicious of anyone outside his immediate family. Elizabeth's diary chronicles this decline in painful detail. William no longer sleeps more than an hour or two each night. He is taken to pacing the halls after midnight, pausing frequently at the top of the basement stairs as though listening for something below. When he does speak, he often refers to making amends and correcting Father's ledger, though he refuses to elaborate on what these phrases mean. Twice now I have found him in the library, staring at portraits of his father with such intensity that he failed to notice my presence even when I spoke his name. By February of 1880, William had begun liquidating the family's business holdings, selling ships, warehouses, and commercial properties at prices well below their market value. The speed and apparent recklessness of these transactions alarmed Boston's financial community, with several longtime business associates attempting to intervene. William rebuffed all such efforts, insisting that the Haversham shipping empire needed to be dismantled. Most puzzling was his insistence on documenting the names of every individual who had ever worked aboard a Haversham vessel, a task that required extensive research through company archives and created significant delays in the liquidation process. In April 1880, William established the Haversham Foundation, endowing it with the majority of his remaining fortune. The foundation's stated purpose was to provide financial support to families of sailors lost at sea and to fund improved medical care for the poor throughout Massachusetts. The specific provisions of the endowment included substantial annual payments to 37 named individuals or their descendants, a list that, when compared with shipping records, corresponds exactly with the crew members who had deserted Haversham vessels during Theodore's experiments. Similarly, the foundation provided significant compensation to the families of 8 Millfield residents who had disappeared between 1843 and 1865, including Michael Sullivan's elderly mother in Ireland, who was located through considerable effort and expense. Dr. Morrison became the foundation's first director, a position he accepted at William's specific request. Morrison's medical journal from this period reveals that the foundation's work went beyond simple financial compensation. WH has charged me with a sacred trust to provide whatever medical or psychological support might be required by those who suffered, directly or indirectly, from Theodore's actions. In cases where the victims left behind family, we offer not only monetary support, but access to the finest physicians and treatments available. WH has made it clear that no expense is to be spared in this endeavor, regardless of the individual's social standing or circumstances. It is, in his words, an inadequate penance but the only one available to us. As the Haversham Foundation's work progressed, William withdrew further from public life. By the summer of 1880, he had relocated his immediate family, Elizabeth and their 2 young children, to a modest house on the Massachusetts coast, far removed from the estate where he had grown up. The mansion itself was emptied of valuables and personal items, then donated to the town of Millfield with strict provisions. The building was to be used as a public hospital, with preference given to patients from disadvantaged circumstances, and under no circumstances was the basement level to be modified or renovated. These conditions were upheld until 1924, when the structure was destroyed in a fire of undetermined origin. William's physical health began to deteriorate alongside his mental state. Dr. Morrison's records indicate that by autumn of 1880, William was suffering from severe weight loss, chronic respiratory issues, and episodes of temporary blindness that medical science of the time could not adequately explain. Morrison documented his own growing concern. "I fear that W.'s condition stems not from any conventional disease process, but from the tremendous psychological burden he has shouldered. He speaks increasingly of his father's contamination, not merely the moral taint of Theodore's actions, but something more literal. W has become convinced that the years he spent living above his father's chamber of horrors have physically affected him, that some miasma has seeped into his blood and tissues. No amount of medical reassurance seems capable of dislodging this belief." Elizabeth's diary entries from this period grow increasingly desperate as she watched her husband's decline. In January of 1881, she wrote, "William woke screaming again last night, clawing at his arms as though trying to remove something from beneath his skin. When I finally calmed him, he spoke lucidly for the first time in weeks, taking my hands and telling me he needed to make a confession. He described dreams, vivid, horrifying dreams, in which he finds himself in his father's hidden room, not as an observer, but as a participant. They aren't just dreams," he insisted. "They're memories, not my own, but his. Somehow, they've transferred to me. I told him this was impossible, that he had never taken part in his father's atrocities. But he looked at me with such certainty that my reassurances died in my throat. Blood calls to blood, he said. Father's work never ended. It merely found a new vessel." William Haversham died on March 12, 1881, 16 months after the discovery of the hidden chamber. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, though Dr. Morrison's private notes suggest that William had effectively lost the will to live, refusing food and medication in his final weeks. He was 42 years old. His funeral was a small, private affair, attended only by immediate family and a few close friends. Notably, he was not interred in the Haversham family mausoleum, but instead cremated at his explicit request, an unusual choice for a man of his background and era. According to Elizabeth's final diary entry regarding her husband, even in death, William feared contamination. His last coherent request was that his ashes be scattered at sea, as far from Millfield and the Haversham name as possible. "Nothing must remain," he told me, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Nothing of father, nothing of me. The line must end." Elizabeth did not honor this last request, at least not entirely. While William's ashes were indeed scattered in the Atlantic, she preserved the Haversham name, raising their son and daughter with a carefully curated version of their family history. She never remarried, dedicating herself instead to the work of the Haversham Foundation, which continue to provide support to those identified as victims of Theodore's activities. Under her guidance, the Foundation expanded its scope to include funding for ethical medical research, with particular emphasis on establishing standards for informed consent and humane treatment of patients. The story of the Haversham family and the secret chamber beneath their mansion might have remained largely unknown to history had it not been for a series of letters discovered during renovations to Dr. Morrison's former home in 1912. These letters, exchanged between Morrison and Elizabeth Haversham over the 2 decades following William's death, provide additional details about both Theodore's experiments and William's subsequent investigation. Most significant among these revelations was the fact that William had eventually succeeded in fully deciphering his father's journal, revealing the full scope of Theodore's research. According to Morrison's account of William's findings, Theodore Haversham had developed an elaborate philosophical framework to justify his actions. A distorted interpretation of Enlightenment principles regarding empirical investigation and the physical basis of human consciousness. Theodore had become convinced that morality was not an abstract concept, but a physical property located somewhere within the human body. His initial experiments focused on the brain, influenced by contemporary phrenological theories, but gradually expanded to include other organs and systems. Most disturbing was his development of a systematic methodology for conducting these investigations on living subjects, based on his belief that moral qualities could only be observed in their active state. Morrison's letters also reveal that William discovered evidence suggesting his father's activities had not gone entirely unnoticed during his lifetime. At least 2 business associates had apparently developed suspicions about Theodore's private research based on correspondence that William found among his father's papers. In both cases, these individuals died under circumstances that, while not overtly suspicious at the time, took on new significance in light of what William had discovered. One suffered a robbery gone wrong while visiting Boston in 1858. The other drowned in a boating accident near the Havsham summer home in 1862. William found subtle references to both incidents in his father's coded journal, suggesting that Theodore had taken direct action to protect his secrets. The hidden chamber beneath the Haversham mansion represented more than just a physical space where atrocities were committed. It embodied the darkest potential of wealth and privilege. When divorced from moral constraint, Theodore Haversham operated with virtual impunity, shielded by his social position, his philanthropy, and the unquestioning respect accorded to men of his status in 19th century New England society. That his own son would ultimately expose and atone for these crimes offers a complex counterpoint to this narrative of power corrupted, suggesting that moral reckoning can transcend even the bonds of family and inheritance. The final letter in the Morrison-Elizabeth correspondence, dated January 1905, just months before Elizabeth's death, contains a passage that perhaps best encapsulates the lasting impact of the Haversham tragedy. "I have often wondered," Elizabeth wrote, "whether the evil that men do truly lives after them, as Shakespeare claimed. In Theodore's case, I believe it does. Not in the continuation of his abominable work, which William so thoroughly eradicated, but in the shadows it cast across generations. Our children, though they never knew their grandfather, carry the weight of his actions in ways both subtle and profound. They move through the world with an acute awareness of how power can corrupt, how respectability can conceal monstrosity. It is a heavy inheritance, but perhaps a necessary one. Some families pass down titles or fortunes. Ours has transmitted a terrible vigilance, an obligation to recognize and oppose inhumanity wherever it might hide, even behind the most respectable facades. The Haversham estate no longer stands on the hill overlooking Millfield. In its place is a medical research facility, built in 1927 on the land donated by the Haversham Foundation, dedicated to ethical scientific advancement and patient advocacy. The foundation itself continues to operate, now focused primarily on bioethics and the humane treatment of research subjects, a mission that serves as both atonement for past horrors and safeguard against their recurrence. As for the secrets that once lay buried beneath the mansion's grand facade, they remain sealed in concrete and brick, a testament to humanity's capacity for both unfathomable cruelty and profound redemption. The stories of Theodore Haversham's victims, the sailors, the laborers, Michael Sullivan, and the others, remain largely untold, their voices silenced by the very power that claimed their lives. Perhaps the true legacy of the Haversham basement is not the horror it contained, but the recognition it demands. That behind every grand mansion, every fortune, every distinguished family name, lies a human cost that must be acknowledged and, whenever possible, addressed. In the hidden chamber of Theodore Haversham, this cost was rendered explicit in the most terrible way imaginable. A brutal secret that would ultimately consume not only its creator, but the family legacy he had sacrificed so much to build.